On the morning of August 12, 1970, a young man named Lawrence Hallahan was driving his car along a quiet, narrow coastal road in County Cork, Ireland. Out the car window to his right, he could see an area called Towhead Bay, which was a beautiful shoreline with a lot of really cool rock formations that also led out to the Atlantic Ocean. People came from all over Ireland to see Towhead Bay, but for Lawrence, the incredible view was just part of his daily commute, so he really was not paying much attention to it. He was just thinking about his day, listening to the hum of his car engine and watching the winding road. However, as he was driving along, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something unusual floating in the water out in Towhead Bay. He slowed down his car, squinted his eyes, and looked out across the gray water. He saw that it was a sailboat, which was really odd. This was not because boats do not belong on the water, they obviously do, but in Towhead Bay, people just did not sail out there because it was simply not safe. There were lots of hidden, jagged rocks just beneath the surface of the water, and the currents were incredibly strong and unpredictable. This was absolutely not a place where you would ever sail a boat if you wanted to keep it in one piece, but then Lawrence, as he was driving along and sort of glancing out at the sailboat, remembered a story that had been all over the local and national news recently. It was about a 66-year-old retired naval officer named Edward Neal, who had gone missing at sea under very mysterious circumstances. A few months ago, Edward had set off in his personal sailboat, which was called the Monaveen, on a journey from England to the Isle of Man. Now, the route was a very simple, straight shot across the Irish Sea that should have only taken about 36 hours to complete under normal conditions, but Edward had never arrived at his destination. His worried family had ultimately reported him missing when his arrival time passed, and the Coast Guard had been searching for his boat ever since, but so far they had not found any sign of it anywhere in the sea. And so his disappearance had quickly become this huge national mystery because it really just did not make any sense at all. First of all, there had not been any serious storms or bad weather in the area where he was going to be sailing during his journey, and so it was highly unlikely that his boat had been damaged by waves or that he had been violently blown off course by a sudden tempest. But then secondly, even if we assume that some kind of unexpected emergency did happen out on the water, Edward was not some amateur sailor who would panic. He was an expert sailor and an expert mariner with decades of experience in the Royal Navy. He was ready to handle practically any emergency at sea, from engine failure to a torn sail. But then even more baffling was the fact that had something happened and had he been completely overwhelmed to the point where even he could not handle it, he never made any distress calls, not once. There were absolutely no radio transmissions or distress calls from him at all. Period. But now, as Lawrence looked out at the boat floating in Towhead Bay, which was hundreds of miles away from Edward's planned route, he saw the name painted on the side of the vessel. It said Monaveen. It was definitely Edward's boat. And so Lawrence's heart began to race in his chest. He could not believe that he had just stumbled upon this massive national mystery. He looked around to see if anyone else was noticing it, but the road was completely empty. And so without really thinking much about it, Lawrence parked his car on the grass, hopped out, and literally just ran down the steep slope to the shore to go investigate further and get a better look at the Monaveen. Lawrence carefully made his way across a bunch of slippery, seaweed-covered rocks until he finally reached the very edge of the water. The Monaveen really was not that far out in the bay. It was floating maybe 3 or 4 yards away from the shore, bobbing gently on the small waves, and so without even taking his shoes or his heavy jacket off, Lawrence just leapt into the cold ocean water and started swimming out to the boat. It only took him a few seconds of swimming to reach the side of the vessel. When he did, he grabbed onto the side rail and pulled himself up onto the wet deck. Once he was up on the deck of the boat, Lawrence looked around and did not see any obvious damage to the hull or the sails, but there also did not seem like there were any signs of recent human activity. So he just began calling out over and over like, "Is anybody here? Is anybody on board?" But there was absolutely no response, only the sound of the wind and the water slapping against the side of the hull. It seemed like Edward must have abandoned his boat at some point. So Lawrence just began exploring the deck, figuring there must have been some kind of major mechanical problem on board, which must have caused Edward to leave it behind. At this point, Lawrence did not really feel like he was invading the guy's privacy because this was a huge news story, and he wanted to see if he could solve this mystery once and for all. Lawrence found his way to the helm of the boat, which is where the steering wheel was located. And there, right beside the steering wheel, Lawrence saw a special type of two-way marine radio. He just reached over and he pressed the on button. To his absolute shock, the radio immediately turned on and started static crackling. The radio worked perfectly. At this point, Lawrence felt a combination of confusion, of curiosity, and of just general unease. I mean, if the radio was fully functional, why had Edward not just called for help? Lawrence saw there was an enclosed cabin area in the center of the deck, which he knew must be where the boat's kitchen, the bathroom, and the sleeping quarters were. So now, feeling a little bit nervous, he walked over to the door, grabbed the handle, and pushed it open. Sure enough, Lawrence found himself standing inside the boat's kitchen, which is called the galley. The kitchen was very clean and also incredibly well stocked with provisions. There were at least a dozen unopened packages of biscuits, along with a bunch of fresh, clean drinking water. There was tea, cocoa, and powdered milk. Seeing all this made Lawrence even more confused because why would any experienced sailor abandon an undamaged boat with a working radio and a massive supply of food and water on board? However, when Lawrence walked from the kitchen area into the bedroom and saw what was in there, he realized that Edward had not abandoned his boat at all. Because right there in the bed, lying under the blankets, was Edward, and he was dead. But it would turn out that once the authorities arrived and found Edward's body, the mystery around what happened to him only got more bizarre. Even though Edward had been missing for 3 months, an autopsy determined that he had only been dead for about 1 month. This meant that for 2 whole months after he vanished, Edward was still alive, drifting somewhere out in the open ocean. But when Lawrence found him, Edward was so emaciated that he practically looked like a skeleton. He weighed just 62 pounds, and the medical examiner determined that he had died of starvation. And so to this day, nobody has ever been able to explain where Edward was during those 2 months when the Coast Guard was searching for him and he was still alive. And why didn't he use his working radio to call for help? And also, how did he starve to death when he was just a few steps away from a well-stocked kitchen? Before we get into our next incredibly puzzling story, let's take a quick moment to talk about our partner for today's video. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Are you so used to keeping everyone else comfortable that you barely notice how often you abandon yourself in the process? I think a lot of us have been there. You get so used to putting everyone else first that taking care of yourself almost starts to feel selfish. And after a while, putting other people first stops feeling like a choice, until one day you realize you can't remember the last time a decision genuinely felt like your own. And the strange thing about constantly managing other people's comfort is that slowly you lose touch with your own. And this is where therapy can help you understand where those patterns come from. It can help you rebuild trust in your own voice, your own instincts, and the parts of yourself that get pushed aside just to keep everybody else comfortable. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the morning of November 10, 1982, a 54-year-old woman named Mary Kemp was sitting in her living room in Salisbury, Maryland, when her phone rang. She answered it and she heard a voice that she instantly knew was her 35-year-old son, Don. Mary smiled when she heard him. She asked Don where he was and how he was doing. For the past month, Don had been on this cross-country road trip. He was working on a book about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. To research it, he had set out in his SUV to go visit a bunch of historical landmarks from the Civil War era. Since Don had set out on this trip, he had made a point to check in with his mother at least once a week to fill her in and let her know how it was going. And this morning, just from the tone of Don's voice, Mary could tell clearly it was still going great. He sounded incredibly happy and excited about all the history he was learning. And so with the phone in hand, Mary walked over to the couch, curled up, and listened as her son told her all about how he was now in Wyoming and he was planning to visit this Old West museum that was there in just a few days. Mary told him to keep it up and have a great time. And then before he hung up, he promised he would call her back in a few days. 6 days later, on the morning of November 16, a highway patrolman was driving down a highway in Carbon County, Wyoming. Carbon County is located about 2,000 miles away from Mary's house in Maryland. This patrolman was basically out in the middle of nowhere on a routine patrol. Through his windshield, all he could see were just open, empty plains on either side, and everything was covered with a thick blanket of white snow. But as the patrolman approached an exit ramp up ahead, he saw something that looked really out of place. There was an SUV just sitting on the exit ramp, just idling right in the middle of the road. Its doors were wide open. There were what appeared to be clothes scattered all over the road sort of outside of this vehicle, and the car had a Maryland license plate. Now, clearly to the patrolman, something was wrong here. So, he pulled over, turned on his lights, and walked up to the SUV to make sure the driver was okay. But when he reached the vehicle and looked inside, because again, all the doors were wide open, there was nobody in there, but through the open doors, he noticed on the other side of the car on the ground were what appeared to be footprints, like a set of footprints. And so the patrolman walked around the car, being careful not to step on all the clothes that were out there in the snow. He went to the other side, and he saw clearly someone had climbed out of this vehicle on the passenger side, landed in the snow, and then he looked, and the footprints wandered not along the road, but they went off the road just out into the vast, snowy wilderness. An hour later, a Carbon County Sheriff's deputy was trudging through the cold snow following those footprints. He, along with several other deputies that he was with, had been sent out here specifically to follow these tracks and see where they went. They wanted to see what happened to the driver of this SUV because this was so incredibly strange. Why would this person have gotten out like that and just wandered off into a freezing environment? What was going on? And so these deputies, they were walking along, looking down, following this trail, and overhead they could hear the sound of a plane, because a plane had also been dispatched by the sheriff's department to fly overhead to see if they could spot this driver somewhere out in the flat wilderness. Now, this area, the area where the driver sort of walked off into, was so flat and so empty, it really should have been quite easy to spot anybody who was wandering around in the snow, but on the ground, the deputy, along with all the others, could not see anybody ahead of them. The footprints just kept on going past empty fields and random farmhouses, and overhead, the pilot in the plane had not seen anyone yet either. And so for the deputies on the ground, after following these tracks for 6 miles, they started to wonder if these were ever going to end. What in the world was this person doing? Where were they going? But at about the 6-mile mark away from the highway, so away from the vehicle, the lead deputy, along with the others, looked up ahead and saw these tracks went right up to this big red barn off in the distance. That appeared to be the destination of the walker. And so now, moving with a bit of a purpose because they were sensing they were about to get to the end of this mystery here to see what happened to this driver, they began walking much faster and followed the tracks right up to this barn. Where the tracks went into the barn was through this now closed door. But there were only prints going into the barn. And unless they exited the barn on the other side or something, it looked like they went into the barn and shut the door and were still inside of there. That was the initial impression of the deputies. But when the lead deputy opened up that closed door and stepped inside, there was absolutely no one in there. It was clear that whoever had walked from the abandoned SUV to this barn had somehow left, but without leaving any new footprints in the snow, which literally should have been impossible. And so the lead deputy left the barn and just looked down at the prints that had led them there as if he was going to learn something new. But actually, as he looked at these prints, which nobody else had stepped in, they had been very careful as they moved to this barn not to mess up the original prints. He noticed that some of the prints looked a little bit misshapen, almost like they had been stepped in more than once. He got down closer in the snow and began to realize that virtually all the prints that they had followed here were sort of misshapen. And so he began backtracking and saw it the whole way. All these prints were like double prints. And so the only conclusion the lead deputy could come to, considering the prints stopped at the barn and there was nobody in the barn, was that this driver, after walking 6 miles in the snow for reasons unknown to this barn, must have left the barn and walked backward, like in reverse in their original tracks, just back the way they came. And so the lead deputy and the others basically began walking the same tracks that brought them to the barn, but now in reverse, looking for maybe some point where it branches off and they just missed it. Maybe there were 1 or 2 steps that went off in a different direction, because no one walks 6 miles in reverse. And also, if that really happened, where was this person? But no, they followed the tracks all the way back to the car, and there were these duplicate prints in every single one of them. So this person literally walked backward for 6 miles, but then they were back at the car and they were like, where did they go? There were no other prints. There was nothing. Where were they? How was this even possible? That evening, investigators ran the abandoned SUV's license plate and learned that it belonged to a 35-year-old man named Don Kemp. Now, they could not get in touch with Don himself, but they did manage to get his mother, Mary, on the phone. And Mary told police that it actually did make sense that her son would be in Wyoming because he was on this big cross-country road trip. But she also said that she had no idea why he would have abandoned his car like that, and she said he had no history of mental illness. He was not taking any medications that could potentially disorient him, and he was just generally a really responsible guy. This did not make sense to her at all. So the sheriff's department just went back to searching the wilderness around where the car was found, looking for Don Kemp, searching the wilderness area, searching near the barn, looking everywhere. But despite searching on foot, with planes, and even on horseback, another really serious push to find him, they did not find anything new. And then on the 3rd day of this big search, a huge blizzard swept through the area and forced the search to stop. The investigators knew that if Don had still been alive and outside in the area, he almost certainly would have frozen to death during that blizzard. And if he had left the area, then he probably had done so on purpose, and he did not want to be found, which could explain why he had apparently purposefully hidden his tracks when he had left the barn. So, at the time of the blizzard, a decision was made not just to postpone the search, but actually to officially call it off. And then after the search ended, for months following it, Don Kemp's name remained in the news. His case was totally fascinating. It was so mysterious. Nobody knew what happened to him, but eventually his case went totally cold. That is until April of 1983, so 5 months after Don disappeared, a woman in New York City received a very bizarre phone call. This woman's name was Judy Aiello, and she actually knew Don personally because they had worked together for 10 years until Don actually went on to leave to go write his book, which entailed him eventually going off and going missing. And so, Judy was well aware of the fact that Don was missing and that the police were still basically looking for him. Maybe not actively, but there was definitely an ongoing search for him. And she knew that so far nobody really knew anything. It was just this big mystery. And so with that as context, one day that April, Judy came home from work and she saw that she had a message on her answering machine. So she clicked the play button. And to her shock, the voice she heard that came out of this answering machine was Don Kemp's. All he said was, "I would like to speak to you again. Call me." And then he gave the phone number to reach him at. And that was it. That was the whole message, but again, Judy had worked with him for 10 years. She was well aware of the fact that he was missing, and she knew this was him. And immediately she called this phone number because, pretty much like everybody else, the belief here was that Don was very likely dead. And now it was like, no, he is fine. He just called me. He is good. I am going to find out what happened to him. Everything is going to be fine. And so she called back this number expecting to hear Don. But when somebody picked up, it was a man, but it was definitely not Don. And so Judy, she just said, "Hey, I would like to speak to Don Kemp. Can you put me in touch with him?" He gave me this number. And the man on the other end of the line, he was very nervous, and he really was not sure why she was calling. It was very uncomfortable for him. And at some point, he was like, "Okay, I will let you talk to Don." But then very quickly, he was like, no, he is not here. And then Judy, she is like, "Well, it is really important that I talk to him. Can you please at least tell him that I returned his call and have him call me back?" And the man was like, "Oh, okay." And he took down her number and he is like, "I will tell him." And then he hung up. And so Judy, she slowly lowered the receiver and put it back in the cradle. And her first thought was like, wow, that was really weird and also very disappointing. I really want to talk to Don. But then she was thinking, wait a minute, is this whole thing just a prank? I mean, because after all, Don's disappearance has been all over the news, and any random person could have heard about it and maybe found out that she knew him. And I mean, it seemed like a really cruel thing to do, but it was possible. However, as she thought about that, she realized that no, this literally could not be a prank. And not just because she was completely certain that the voice on her answering machine had been Don's, but also because Judy's phone number was not listed in a phone book anywhere, which meant whoever placed the call and left that voicemail had to have known Judy personally. There was no other way to get that number. And so at that point, Judy realized it was not good enough to wait and hope that Don called her back. She had to go talk to the police. The next day, almost 2,000 miles away from New York City, where Judy had reported the bizarre phone call to the police, a police captain in Casper, Wyoming, knocked on the door of a trailer. So this captain, whose name was Mark Benton, had found out that the phone call Judy had received that she reported to police had been traced to this address in Wyoming, to this trailer. And this address was actually only about a 2-hour drive from the location where Don Kemp's abandoned SUV was found 5 months earlier. Benton already knew that this trailer belonged to a man named Mark Dennis. So when the door opened and Benton saw a man standing there, he asked, "Are you Mark Dennis?" And the man nodded and said, "Yes." So at that point, Captain Benton explained that he was there to investigate a phone call that had been traced back to this address and that this phone call was potentially connected to the disappearance of a man named Don Kemp. But Mark just sort of stared back at Benton with a look of total confusion on his face. And then he said he did not know anything about a phone call to New York and that he had never even heard of a Don Kemp. Now, Benton was not totally buying this because the idea that this guy lives 2 hours away from where Don went missing and it was all over the news 5 months ago and still is on the news pretty regularly, the idea that you had never heard of this guy was just a little bit fishy. And so he asked Mark if he would be willing to come take a polygraph. And to his surprise, Mark said, "Sure." A couple of days later, Benton was sitting in his office at the sheriff's department and he called Mark to schedule his polygraph. But Mark did not answer the phone, so Benton left him a voicemail. And then a little while later, Benton got a call back, but it was not from Mark. It was from his new attorney, who said Mark would no longer be speaking to the police any further about this topic. A few weeks later, and another 2,000 miles away, Don't Mother, Mary Kemp sat in her home in Maryland, clutching the phone to her ear as Captain Benton gave her an update on her son's case. So Mary knew about the phone call Judy had received, which actually had been followed by several more calls, all from the same number. Judy never actually answered these calls. They all went to voicemail, they all sounded like Don. The messaging was very similar. It is like, "I want to talk to you, call me back." But she was never able to actually connect with Don. Judy was not. And so for Mary, she was convinced that the answer to her son's disappearance must have something to do with Mark Dennis, because he was the guy who owned the trailer where all these calls were coming from, and he has lawyered up instead of taking his polygraph. Like, it must have to do with him. What other solution could there be here? Like, he must be involved. He has to be. But now, as part of his update to Mary, Captain Benton was telling her that Mark Dennis had outright denied knowing her son. And because Mark was not officially a suspect, they did not have any concrete evidence against him, and he was not talking because he had lawyered up. The police were not planning to investigate him any further. And Mary, when she heard this, was genuinely stunned. I mean, those calls from Mark's trailer were the only clue that anybody had found in months, and she just could not understand why the investigators were not looking into this more seriously. From day one, she had felt like Don's disappearance was at the bottom of the sheriff's department's priority list. They had called off the search after only a few days, and now they had barely looked into the only suspect they had, who again lawyered up as soon as he was asked to take a polygraph test. Like, what is that? And so Mary was not sure if these investigators were just incompetent or what, but she knew that at this point there was only one thing she could do. She was going to fly out to Wyoming, and she was going to investigate her son's disappearance herself. A few weeks later, a very agitated Mary Kemp barged into the Carbon County Sheriff's Office in Wyoming, which was the law enforcement agency that originally investigated Don's disappearance. She walked right up to the front desk, identified herself, and demanded to see all the files on her son's case. The clerk looked a little bit taken back by the way Mary was acting, but she nodded and then got up and went into the back of the office. And about a minute later, she came back with a file folder, and so she handed it over to Mary. Mary grabbed it, walked over to a nearby chair, sat down, opened up this file folder, and began flipping through all the evidence that had been collected so far. And Mary very quickly realized that there was way more to this story than the investigators had told her. Because as she looked at photos of her son's car from where it had been found on the highway when it was abandoned, she realized that it did not actually look like her son had just stopped at random, gotten out and walked off like the police had said. No, his car looked like it had been struck. The mirror on the passenger side of the car was broken, and a gasket had been ripped off the door. So, the gasket is the rubber sealing around the rim of the door so that when it shuts, it seals. Well, part of it had been ripped off the door, and also the key, which was still in the ignition when the car was found, was completely bent in half. And so, to Mary, based on these photos, it immediately seemed obvious, at least to her, that her son did not just pull over and walk off. He must have been forced off the side of the road. Maybe somebody struck his car and maybe they drove off, but maybe the impact of the strike had disoriented her son and it caused him to wander off, or maybe somebody intentionally ran him off the road and then forced him, grabbed him, and dragged him out of the car and led him off somewhere. But then also Mary was thinking, well, if there was another person who got out of their vehicle, where were their prints? Because there was only one set of prints, her son's. Or were those her son's prints? Were those his prints? She did not know. And so it was just totally confounding. But Mary realized even if there was somebody else that sort of caused her son to go missing, somebody who ran him off the road or who grabbed him and pulled him out or whatever, overlooking all the facts, which were like, where are their footprints and why isn't there another car that we found that ran into him? Forget all that. Mary realized if there were other people involved, it was going to be nearly impossible to figure out who they were. Because for reasons she just could not understand, the investigators had not fingerprinted her son's car when it was found, and they had not made casts of the footprints in the snow. So there was no way to prove if anyone besides Don had been in the car, or if Don was even the one who made those tracks in the snow. And so any forensic evidence that could have maybe helped solve this case was now long gone. So if Mary wanted to find her son, she basically had to start from scratch. Over the next few weeks, Mary Kemp stayed in Wyoming and conducted her own investigation. She tracked down Mark Dennis, the man from the trailer where those bizarre phone calls had originated, and she actually spoke to him on the phone. However, just like he had with the police, Mark denied knowing anything about Don or those phone calls, and when Mary accused him of lying, he just hung up. Mary visited all the places she could think of where Don might have gone. She also spoke to workers at the museums and other locations where she knew her son had been planning to go as part of his research for his book. She hired a private investigator, she put up posters with a reward for information, and she even went to a psychic for help. But basically, nothing worked. She got nowhere until finally she got one meaningful lead. Through her investigation, Mary learned that apparently in April of 1983, around the time Judy got those strange phone calls, two people had seen a man who matched Don's description in Casper, which was the same town where Mark Dennis's trailer was. One was a bartender at a local tavern who remembered serving Don, and the other was someone who remembered seeing him at a traveling exhibit about Abraham Lincoln. And remember, the whole reason Don was even out there to begin with was to research Abraham Lincoln. So Mary thought that sighting at least had to be credible. I mean, it would be a pretty crazy coincidence if Don just happened to have a perfect doppelganger in Casper, Wyoming, who also happened to love Abraham Lincoln. However, by the time Mary actually learned about these sightings, it had been at least a full month since the actual sightings occurred. And now, it seemed like if Don really had been in Casper, he was not anymore. Mary did not find any other trace of her son there or any clues as to where he might have gone next. I mean, the whole situation was so weird that Mary literally could not form a coherent theory about what might have happened to her son. In fact, the more Mary thought about it, the less sense any of this made. And so, basically, she just reached a total dead end and eventually gave up and went back home to Maryland. And for the next 2 years, Mary continued not to get any answers about her son. But then, on October 4th of 1985, so almost 3 years after Don disappeared, everything changed. That day, a group of hunters were hiking through the woods in Carbon County, Wyoming, when one of them looked up ahead and they saw what looked like a bunch of white rocks lying in the grass. And so these hunters, they moved up to get a better look at these rocks. And as they got closer, they realized they were definitely not rocks, they were bones. And in fact, as they got close enough, they saw it was not just a couple of bones. It was like a perfectly intact human skeleton just lying in the grass. It was still wearing clothes, but just bones inside the clothes. When sheriff's investigators arrived on the scene, they found a wallet that was inside the skeleton's pants pocket. And in that wallet, there was a driver's license with the name Don Kemp. An autopsy found that Don had died of exposure, and there was no sign of foul play. The sheriff's department's official conclusion was that on the day he disappeared, Don must have suffered a mental breakdown and walked into the wilderness voluntarily, and then at some point he had died, likely in that blizzard that happened 3 days later. Now, this sounds like a neat and tidy explanation, but really, it only raises more questions because Don's body was found only 4 miles away from where his car was abandoned. Investigators had searched that area for days, and even if Don had been trying to hide from the search teams for whatever reason, this area was so bare and so flat that there really was nowhere to hide. And so it's just hard to imagine that Don was basically right there the whole time and nobody saw him, but then even if Don really had somehow died in the blizzard 3 days after his car was found, and despite all this search effort, he was never located. Let's pretend that actually happened. Well, then who made those phone calls from Mark Dennis's trailer 5 months later to Judy? Like, who was that? And also, how had he been spotted by 2 different people walking around the same town where those calls came from? And if there really was no foul play involved, why was Don't Car so weirdly damaged when it was found? Like, who did that? The Carbon County Sheriff's Department was never able to answer any of those questions. And so Mary Kemp, when she died in 2014, died still wondering what really happened to her son. If mysterious deaths that leave behind more questions than answers are your kind of story, then you should really check out another episode of ours on Ricky McCormack, which is another very bizarre, deeply puzzling case, where the truth proved to be incredibly difficult to pin down. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.